So I've had a lot of trouble doing this talk and have ended up with bits and pieces that I've strung together. The title that you saw sort of riffed off of the reactions that I had initially when I read the title of the conference itself. Some of the issues have already come out in discussions yesterday. And so I'm still kind of talking under that rubric, but yeah, riffing, I think, and a bit too. And I hope that some of this holds together. I'm starting out by thinking about some of the issues that have come up in discussions about culture. And that's where we began. And then I'm going to go into a bit about the politics of design. So let me begin by shamelessly, and do you have the little things to hold up? Because I didn't have time to time myself. Okay. So let me begin by shamelessly borrowing from an anthropologist whose work I greatly admire. Oh, and I'm going to read, and Ray knows why, because if I don't, I become completely nonlinear, and it gets worse. So, Jane Geyer is one of those rare anthropologists who treats the theories of the people she works with as seriously as those of the usual suspects that anthropologists invoke. And I guess this is, partly said in the context that she's an economic anthropologist, and so that's something that I think of as using a different kind of theory. The image on the screen comes from a short paper she wrote after a book called Marginal Gains that deals with economic transactions, monetary transactions, and the ways that they developed in culturally very different ways on the Atlantic African coast, what's now Nigeria, but the area that was a nexus in the transatlantic slave trade. So she has moved on to a topic dear to Ray's heart, money, and written some short papers on this. But what you see, press down, not up, is a graph plotting information from just two of countless examples in media reports of something better and something worse, something more, something less, which seems to be the structure of a great deal of research and education and all kinds of, quantitative studies. But what you can see here, which crosses, and you could plot onto this, rankings of hospital sports salaries, colleges in U.S. News and World Reports, brand rankings, whatever, that there's a very small population at the top and a steep drop to obscurity. So Geyer urges further anthropological investigation into the complex interactions that all combine to make this happen. And she does lay out some of the ways that she thinks that something like this could come about. The pattern keeps going. And if you don't like the word pattern, then how about ad hoc transspatial choreography or quasi-coincidental concerted redundancy? Those things, if I said things like that, then I would have a better job at a fancier institution. So innovation in wording is a big part of scholarship. Anyway, I hope that anthropologists of education will heed Geyer's call, because I think these days the top and drop ordinal scenario of rare worthies and mass unworthies, which also tracks with growing income disparity, is actually more like how American education does sorting than the old infamous bell curve. The bell curve is starting actually to look good to me. Tabling, though, this grim prospect, what do you want to call phenomena like those captured on Geyer's graph? Obviously, there's no explicit cultural plan going on that can account for this. No shared ritual like, on the full moon, we climb up the ancestral mound, we lift 2 cups of wine in the air, and after a chant, we pour the wine on the ground as a libation to the ancestors to ask for continued prosperity. That's culture, as in my culture, your culture, a recognized and recognizable repertoire of the doings of a group, and a potent and necessary power base for having a say in one's own and one's consociates' fates. It's also a way to organize, that pushback gets organized in similar forms. In addition, though, what Gregory Bateson called an economy of conscious thought is also rolling along. That if we were like centipedes, we're centipedes and we had to think of where each leg was going, we would fall all over ourselves. And so I refuse to call this habitus because that seems like a reification into a package that an economy of conscious thought, that things are always going in and out of, fits very well with notions of learning and proficiency, because when you can forget about it is when you really know what you're doing well enough to just roll on. I think that Geyer is talking, though, about organization on a level that is far more across persons than that. So we go up a notch, and she does at this point invoke Bateson. The results of ordinal ranking seem very close to what Bateson called schismogenesis, the continual reproduction, confirmation, and intensification of difference, which is then ritually marked when the process itself is momentarily suspended, as if for collective contemplation and affirmation. Well, and I don't know, I could argue with her about what Bateson is saying, but, basically upending the whole thing for a while. She points out that several of the images for the peak of the parabolic order come straight from the great chain of being, the encompassing theory of all life that was developed in Christian Europe after religious intellectual hegemony in the Middle Ages. It is a vast, inclusive, fixed, that is, non-competitive, hierarchical ordering that seems to be staging a remarkable comeback in imagery these days, end quote. The point for present purposes is that it's both an implicate pattern and an explicit design that required massive concerted sorting, policing, and innovating to keep going. You can, say there was a great chain of being, but to keep redoing it for hundreds of years, people have to be doing very different things through that time. So how's everybody organized to get something in motion that counts over time as a changing sane? So with that in mind, let's just take a brief aside into some education territory, heavily designed. The resemblance to the great chain of being is no accident, since they're both members of the alive and well tree diagram clan. Note also that the top of the pyramid is only big enough for 1 or 2 CEOs commanding high salaries and a couple of stallions. We don't want to push that too far, but the changes from 1956 to 2002 suggest there's been a lot of writing and debating and recalibration. And yes, creativity comes into its own. One of my students did one of those Google things where you search all the books, and I asked him to search intelligence versus creativity, because I think that creativity is just the word that has been substituted for intelligence in, historically, and because of innovation in business and technology. But anyway, sure enough, there is a switch that starts to really be apparent in the 80s, and by this time has really crested. The pointy head, though, remains just as small. Okay, so now we get to the period of time in which multiculturalism is coming into its curricular own. And again, the backdrop question is, what are you going to call this kind of organization? For me, with scare quotes over everything, I might as well say American culture. Anyway, there is an attempt at that time to level the playing field. So the pyramid gets tipped over, made circular, designed with curves into a more amiable form. And now remembering is really little. So you're so creative that you don't remember a thing. I've lived that, sort of. However, design never stops, and neither does a good brand, which Harold Bloom, not Harold Bloom, oh wow, what another Floridian slip. What was his first name? Is it? It is Harold? Howard. Harold is the critic. Anyway, so when you get to this point, I think the teacher user of the design need no longer worry about reading the fine print, because he or she has zoned into the mandala and sees the imminent spark of the divine in everything, which is what we would hope that people would, one way they might contextualize learning. But the fine print, of course, gets you. Okay, so I know that I shouldn't be flippant, because a lot of hopes are invested in these things. And when I was studying the creativity literature, one of the methods I used was to just accumulate texts from schools and especially, and look at where the word appeared. And I'd say the same happens with innovation now, that it's going to be in the first or the last paragraph. So it's either an aspiration or it's a conclusion that that's what your teaching did for people. But there is no referent for this. It's a completely floating signifier. All these words are things you can just, pack different kinds of psychological, supposed putative attributes under as needed. So here I think we have something that is, kind of at a place that was coming up a little in the discussion maybe yesterday, or at least in my thinking, where graphic design has sort of hit a wall at the intersections of the kinds of complex information gathering and nonlinearity that we're becoming more accustomed to. Now I'm going to just go over to something really different. Has anybody wondered what the picture was on your... What do you think, Miranda? Yes, please. I think you... Pardon me? Both and. Absolutely. Absolutely. And the Garden of Eden, I know you're right, and I did not know that. But I know you're right because of how things like this work. And I think you'll know why I know you're right when I read you some background of what I sort of figured out it was. What Ray was referring to as looking at junk, anthropologists have to really pay attention to native terms. And for 20 years, I was off and on the road, doing field work, going to African American yards to visit with the people who put things in them that I noticed as I was going by. And this was not my original idea. I had a wonderful teacher named Robert Ferris Thompson. I throw this in as an aside because as a general statement about the arts of Africa and the diaspora, and talking about performance, he stressed again and again that they embed the theory that action is the highest form of reason. Now that proliferation of action, if you think about how that goes absolutely the reverse of the contemplation, elite contemplation-based model that education has been orienting to for so long, it's worth a lifetime of scholarship, which I've tried to do 15 minutes of in the scheme of history. But that is built in here. You have, I want to go back to and actually read this because I get excited whenever I look at something like this and I forget what I wanted to say. So you've got some media here that is as old as oak, an oak forest. And I like that it came out to be on here because I get really, really tired of the common usage of technology as new stuff, innovative stuff that is for sale now that I want, or that is, all supposedly making life more complex. All of those kinds of rhetorics. When most of the people in the world are getting by with hammers, nails, and sorting the technological refuse that gets shipped to places like Ghana and other places. That they're sorting, this is an aside riff, but what the heck. That sorting is not, it is considered part of a discussion about technology, but when the focus is on people, they are the marginalized. They are not usually treated as part of the technology system, at least as I run into, discussions of this. This may be changing, but simply to say that the chairs that people, not to forget the chairs people sit on, teddy bears they can put in front of the computer, all of these physical materiality aspects have not gone away, though the virtual may exist. Back to the point. When I picked this, Brigitte Bardot and I were trying to figure out some image. Hervé wanted some kind of image from some kind of stuff I did, and we looked at a lot of them, but we had to have something. You can look at the brochure for this where the white print would show up in PowerPoint, right? So this is, we also need to remember this is mediated through my film photograph in 1992, the digital scanner, a color printer, and my computer and all of that. So that's part of what long time ago, late 80s, Arjun Appadurai called the biography of that. That was Igor Kopytov. But anyway, there's a very famous paper on this, the life of objects. But turning now to what Mr. Clarence Burse made in Northern Neck, Virginia, he is one of about 12 people I got to know well during field work, and then many other places and people who allowed me to document what they did. He used a kind of stochastic ad hocing, that is, pulling in stuff that he could use that might read as a junk pile. Oh, native terms, junk, back to that. So when people I talk to use the word junk, often they looked at me really hard. And I eventually learned the hard look was to see if I could see more than a surface, which is what a lot of this is about. Levels of vision, pedagogy in vision. So junk, substituting other words that would get used later, is an antique. An antique is something ancestors owned. So here you have a very serious interleaving of elements that are assembled on and refer to at least, in this case, 15 generations of an African American family in the same place. We're going back to the 18th century here, in slavery in the northern net. I don't have a picture of the whole thing, so I'm going to act it out. Here I am, a tree. So, pulsing out of the ground, digging into the ground, right here on my chest, and oh, do serious scholars and historians hate me when I say this, but if you look at a Congo and Nkisi, a power figure, there's a glass disc right here. On the chest of this tree was a television. The reason I know that you're right about the snake as one part of this is that television is a pun. A pun with words. Vision, telegraphs, communication over distance, and a big glass bottle, which is what an old television tube looks like too. Everything is a both and. Everything is the television and these other things. A bottle and the other associations. So then you go up the trunk and you get here, and people there and in the South call this the crotch of a tree. The crotch is where the generations come from, right? It's also the parting of the ways, where the other world goes from. How do I know all this? It takes a long time, and I'm not going to tell you because I wrote it down somewhere else. I don't want to get into that. So just take me at my word, because it recurs over and over again. So there are many, many people that I met, who would never engage in anything that was tacky or pornographic. It's white people who write bathroom graffiti. African Americans rarely write bathroom graffiti on walls, just another little ethnographic aside. So when there are crotches, or in some cases I have seen actual pictures taken from magazines of women showing the birth canal from angles that are considered pornographic. They are connected to they are in organization put with something that is moving on, moving across the generation. So here, right over the crotch, you've got the red of lifeblood, and then moving off to whiteness, which goes with churches and spirit and things like that. So you've got spiraling across through time, and then you can barely see that the whole tree is filled with bottles. So anthropologists, I haven't met any anthropologists who've been interested in this in this whole 25 years. And I have to say that though I think that it it's partly that I haven't said anything about this very well to appeal to anthropologists of education, but I think that it's just been too far out. Nobody thinks it has anything to do with education. I think it's pedagogical. I think it's I go one after another to immersion environments. They are uncommon, they are special, they are not typically African American, as someone might just like to say, and they are not in a tradition in the sense of being passed down to one person from a parent. What they are is assemblages, stochastic assemblages out of accumulations that include sermons people have heard, proverbs. Zora Neale Hurston, a very famous anthropologist and writer, wrote down a lot of, talked about concrete expressions that African Americans used in the South, like puzzle gut and shovel-headed. So these translate really beautifully into material form that would come out with something like this. So it's a specialization less common than being the lead singer in your church, but more common than becoming an anthropologist. This led me, and it's not bricolage and it's not yard art. It's an altar for the ancestors, if you're going to call it anything. The reason I get real upset with terms, because the only people who do pay attention is, as a large group these days, are people in the art world and the art market, where this is outsider art, vernacular art. There's a horribly, what is it called? The Visionary Museum in Baltimore. And all these words had some of them at least, had some integrity when they were talking about maybe the vernacular, which a word that I used in my dissertation but will never use again for this sort of thing. They all had some integrity in certain contexts of use, but when you line them all up, they are y'all run into in education the euphemism escalator. Somebody mentioned this in relation to autism. Educably mentally retarded. When that was not an acceptable phrase, another phrase came along. And there are, so this is in Wikipedia, that's where I learned this, but you can look at the stacks of terms, but the treatment of people is not necessarily changing. So there is a euphemism escalator on terms that do the work of primitivism. And it is very important in American culture to have primitives, primitive people. Primitive people do this, and then art collectors and other people like that can project onto it whatever they want and look smart for finding it. How much time do I have? Wow, I can do a lot. All right, so moving right along at a better clip. Long ago, I got this fellowship right out of graduate school in DC at Dumbarton Oaks, which is a research center that Harvard has that has 3 units: pre-Columbian studies, garden and landscape studies, and Byzantine studies, which is their biggie. And one of the pre-Columbianists said, you ought to apply there because you've got a lot of pictures of trees. So tell me life is not contingent. They gave me a chance to sort of gather my information on this, which I had gathered because working on literacy, there were so many fights about what literacy and writing systems were in the Yale anthropology department, and people were so testy that I went out and did research for another dissertation, because what can you do? And then they thought, because it all dealt with African Americans, it wasn't a separate problem anyway. So everything gets, lumped. But the point of well, see, that's why I need to be reading. I can't remember what the point is. Oh yeah, at Dumbarton Oaks, after I'd been there a while, this was a very unusual project for them. They had the first person who broke out of the mold of studying the canon of gardens. So the person who preceded the man who brought me in, who studied Nazi landscape architecture, yeah, he's great, was a Harvard scholar of Italian gardens, and she leaned her head around and said, there are no African American gardens, no African gardens, so there can be no African American gardens, so what are you doing here? And then she left. So I thought about that for a really long time, and eventually, 17 years later, I applied again to find out what it was in their literature that could have people continuing to say this. And I found out that they were continuing to say it because I sat next to a woman who had actually been brought in from Harvard to work in the Obama administration. And she leaned over at the talk after asking me what I did, what I was looking at, and said, do Africans have landscape? Now, at that point, I said we all stand on something, you know. But what I've been researching is how is it that, I mean, after the creativity stuff where I was really trying to study some niche of the field of psychology, then I find myself doing this, and I think, oh, people put labels on different kinds of anthropologies. So I'm an anthropologist of academic disciplines, I guess. And then they, you know, I don't mean to pick on them because I'm also doing the same thing, I hope, to myself and my fellow anthropologists at the same time. But I do think that landscape design has some special features about it. And these textbooks are one of the sources that I have used. They date from the 70s, when landscape architects, starting with Norman T. Newton at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, began to feel like they needed to have their students feel a sense that they were part of a long history in a fairly new kind of world of official professionalization. They began to write these really fat books. Oh, yeah. Oh, I see. Good. I have a picture that I need. So Newton's book was pretty unpretentious, but Sir G.J. up there is Sir Geoffrey Jellicoe, and he and his wife Susan wrote The Landscape of Man, shaping the environment from prehistory to the present. So you can see that the goals of the book are very modest, right? Yeah, they weren't especially. So they actually start with the creation. Their goal is to show that landscape design is the prime mover of, quote, the progress of civilization. So literacy, great divide, advocates, beware, there is another bigger mark of civilization. And our best hope for averting environmental catastrophe. Now, again, like with Bloom and the mandala and all of that, you know, it's really hard to do a critique and not be condescending sounding to people. But the problem at issue, I think, with so many of us in the academy is how do we get organized to do these things that we, as a group, that we would not condone individually. And you would never find a nicer group of people than landscape architects. They like bugs, bees, trees, they do really hard work. However, this field and landscape historians, who have one foot in art history, have managed until 2013 to have a field big enough to have a huge library that Harvard would put together as a huge library, which means it's huge. And in that, there were 4 books, including the African diaspora on this subject. 2 of them were written by me, which is a really sad state of affairs. And 8 articles, again, maybe 4 of them written by me. So how did this happen? How, through all of the upheavals and critiques of imperialism and colonialism and the fact that now there are, maybe approaching 40 landscape-centered UNESCO World Heritage Sites in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, is the only part of the populated world, that part of Africa where Black Africans are concentrated. I think this is one of those cases that really points up Blackness as a special case, because rich array of Asian contributions, many of them presented in language that needs to be critiqued, but at least you will find some representation. Every other place on the map gets some mention. And back in time, mound builders, Incas, Mayas, and even, what was his name? Oh, name somebody who froze to death in Antarctica. Okay. Who? Could be. Whatever it is. I'm trying to skip spots here, and that makes me even more disorganized. But his base camp is in the literature. That's the point. They've even got one landscape in Antarctica that is included. Now, so how can this happen? Well, this is where I find Jane Geyer a bit of an inspiration with the Great Chain of Being, because certainly this goes back to at least the beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade. You can see a marked change in representations of African landscape that happens at about the 1670s. Before that, Africans and their cities and infrastructure were all portrayed on a par level. And reports were constantly coming in from Europeans, saying that they were in a city that was bigger than anyone they had ever seen in Europe, which might well have been so, because Accra had 120,000 people. The list goes on of populations, concentrations. So again, I asked this question about quote unquote culture. This doesn't reduce to any one simple knowledge base of culture. It is, like the Great Chain of Being and all sorts of other things, a morphing trajectory. But I do think that there is sort of a key thing here that has become, from the question of why was Africa left out, I have arrived at original sin. Now, you were all supposed to laugh then. Anyway, the thing is that Edenic ideals of perfection map out, they design a way of looking at the world that has morphed and in some cases been discussed by scholars with reference to gender. Also, Edenic imagery comes up a great deal in initial reports from travelers, like especially Europeans who went in the so-called age of exploration to places that were warm, and they had never been warm for so long before or seen so much to eat. So they thought they were in paradise until they got sick. So the imagery of the creation comes up in this landscape design discourse. Here is Jellicoe. Cloud masses hung over a barren landscape, so hot that constant rain turned to steam. Since the creation, the Earth's surface continually worked its way, and then blah, blah, to the racial groupings that existed at the beginning of recorded history. The central civilizations comprise that part of the Caucasoid race whose civilization began with the Sumerians, and the eastern civilizations composed of Mongoloid races of India, China, Japan, and pre-Columbian America, all of whom got chapters in the book. The Jellicoes continue with Bushmen and Negroids, who are not mentioned again. Now, this be okay, you'd understand it. Jellicoe designed for colonial administrations in Africa and made no provision whatsoever for indigenous Africans. But what is remarkable is that the same table of contents continues to the present. That means that a diversifying field has students going to work on a continent that seems to have no design possibilities of its own that are worth learning about. And people just say, oh, well, pretty much. So the part of the paper you're not going to get to hear is where I go off on how the definition of design that saturates design and innovation discourses continues to be a projection from the head of the designer onto some part of the world. Obviously, this is Cartesian dualism, and obviously it is a really good fit with capitalism, because when it comes from your head to materials, you know who to pay and who to promote. So with that, I'll stop.
So I wanted to comment more on the first part of the paper. I'm really interested in the representations, the design-based representations of learning that Grey brought to us, and these, for example, these three different versions of Benjamin Bloom's taxonomy, to think about what difference a visual representation of a concept makes for us. These concepts matter, and visual representations of those concepts matter. I remember very distinctly being a first-year teacher in high school and being issued the Bloom Pyramid and thinking about how to use that in my instruction. And then later as a faculty member, revisiting that as I thought about learning objectives for my syllabi and those sorts of things. Ways that I could write learning objectives to make them legible to the people who would review the syllabus to approve it, and then also to the Standards Commission that review our curriculum regularly, right? So I think she gave us the three different visual representations, or four really, versions of the Bloom's taxonomy are interesting for us to think about. I thought I might pull up one more. Well, we may not be able to, but let me describe it. One that I've seen more recently is a distinction, and this links back to Juliet's paper, a distinction of a representation of the autism spectrum those of you who have a computer with you, if you just type autism spectrum and do Google image, you'll see what I'm talking about. So the distinction between having a continuum, where on one end you're more autistic and on one end you're less autistic, and having that re-represented as a circle in the middle, and these elements, these characteristics of autism that sort of branch out from that. So social skills and I can't remember what all the elements around the circle are, but executive functioning and other things. And I know in my own experience and in talking with other parents what a difference that makes, that visual representation of autism when you try to understand it yourself and when you try to explain it to educators, to well-meaning family members, et cetera. Right, so I think it's important for us to think about the design-based elements of representing learning or of representing learning needs. And I think Mimi yesterday posed a really important question for us. She said, what are the stakes of anthropology's definition of learning? It's a really significant question for us. So I've heard learning defined here in our day together as social interaction, as difficult collective deliberations, as cultural production, as cultural analysis of cultural analysis, as peripheral participation, as design-based learning, as connected learning, which entails socially embedded, interest-driven learning oriented toward educational, economic, and political opportunities, right? So these are very different understandings of learning, and I think we need to spend more time working through how we define it, whatever it is, what constitutes evidence of it, and then we haven't talked much about this, but how we make it meaningful to other people, including to the teachers that we work with and our colleagues in schools of education, for those of us who are situated that way. And I think this matters for a variety of reasons. It's not just an intellectual exercise. These ideas, these definitions, these notions, and their visual representations have consequences. And as Grey noted, we can't afford to be flippant about these things. There are, she said, all kinds of hopes invested in them. And personally, I'm not willing to turn learning over to more psychological approaches or more cognitive approaches. I'm not willing to vilify teachers and schools. I think there are deep hopes invested in those spaces. As a parent and as a citizen, I feel that way. And I think that kind of flippancy about schooling and about education just gives further fodder to privatization efforts that are well underway, and I am concerned about that. So those are the thoughts that Gray's presentation provoked for me, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the other participants thought and then what you all think. Thank you.
So I think, I'm not sure if based on how this panel is set up and how the tables are organized, if this was supposed to be a form of presenter meets critic. From my perspective, it's more presenter meets fan. I enjoyed this talk a lot. And I wanted to kind of mention a few things that I really liked about your talk, Grey, and think about how some important implications of your talk for maybe rethinking what we mean by design and trying to rethink education. So I loved this kind of historical perspective that you took to helping us understand, what order and ranking is and where it comes from, and you're kind enough not to use the kinds of descriptors that confuse the subject matter oftentimes, but I wanted to point them out at least a little bit to kind of think about, to show, how important this point of looking at how notions like order and ranking have become meaningful in various large-scale historical activity frames. I'm sorry? Oh, you can't hear me? Okay, I'll just hold it up. I think I'm too tall for these. I guess that would be helpful. And so I was thinking that, I appreciated tracing order and ranking all the way back to the Great Chain of Being, a historical link that isn't very common to kind of helping us challenge notions of order and ranking in contemporary society, and following those through the 20th century and what we would often term modernist activities, and oftentimes contemporarily we see these same ideas manifest in different historical activity frames, what many call neoliberalism, right? And I was thinking that part of something that was implicit in your talk that you didn't spell out so much, but I thought that was equally important to kind of mention now, is the notion of commensurability, right? So in addition to order and ranking, part of order and ranking involves not just the kinds of inequalities that are established through having a few at the top and many at the bottom, which I appreciated for kind of challenging me to rethink that a different type of inequality that's always present in rankings, but also just the idea that that order means that individuals have to come to seem like those dominant discourses, right? And if they're not like those dominant discourses, then they can't even be recognized in any form, and they're pushed out of the rankings or making order. And so I was thinking that there are a lot of implications for that point. One is that when you're talking about the museum situations where cultures of Africa weren't often, or having a harder time being analyzed or found in museums, you may be making a provocative argument. Are you saying that perhaps even that there's some kind of racial politics to commensurability that keeps people from recognizing forms that exist? And I suspect you're not making an argument that extreme, but I think there's something there. And I was thinking this notion of commensurability is also important for thinking about design, right? If we're talking about design as education, you so importantly called our attention to the verb design, right? Just that when we think about design as a verb that's doing something, you oftentimes have a gloss on the design as kind of exciting or new, but what you're showing us, right, is that implicit to the pragmatics of the word design, your design implies a degree of sameness that forces individuals that's necessary to recognizing what constitutes technology and how it should be constituted, right? So that continuation of sameness that we oftentimes forget about by getting excited by words like design, I think is especially important. So I enjoyed your talk, and I would love to hear more about how you saw those same themes, perhaps, or didn't see them in your work.
Do I say something about that, or do we go with? Well, I'll just say thank you to you both. I think they're really both really important things, and I think there have been some, there's been some work on representations, but when you said this about representations in education, I was thinking, wow, are they not already out there? And if they're not, then that is really crucial, because they are really, and when I was a museum educator, there was somebody whose name I have erased, who had what was it? Apprehension, interpretation, appreciation. And so we educators went to a workshop, and I thought this was mind-blowing at the time. It helped me organize how I talked and worked with students about art. And now I think I've just become, I'm just really, I see no alternative, but I'm also very, very skeptical about static representations. And so I do see more possibilities coming out of interfaces on computers. I mean, if you took something like autism, which I just have conversations with someone at work about for family reasons, the making sense of things on the web in all of their diversity makes the person looking for information really do a lot of evaluative thinking about the sources, about the experiences that are recounted, that graphing things out really obscures So the final Bloom attempt, where I feel like graphic design does hit a kind of wall, is a recognition of complex phenomena, right? And so the question is, given that there is always more complexity than administrators and reporters and brokers of money for education want to handle, what is the best, most effective way to get at it? And I mean, on this, I'm just going to pass the buck to one of my teachers, whose name was Edward Tufte, and he does statistics, but what he says is that if you want to do statistics, you need to hire a statistician, because the kinds of statistics that oversimplify and do correlations and simple causation are more misleading and just are a part of a pile-on of misrepresentation. So, you know, complex modeling of ecosystems and complex modeling of autism networks might look much more similar. And they still have reductive propensities, but they can lead you, at least confuse you enough, as web things do. I mean, confuse you enough to go try to find out more. And so, that said, I think that I agree, there needs to be a very explicit discussion among advocates about how to, now going to your issue, of how to do representations of complexity. And this Edward Tufte has tackled this problem in his books on visual representation of quantitative information. There are 4 of them, and they're really, really good. And he is sort of an icon in the design field. He's gone more and more over into design. So I highly recommend some of these, and especially some of his more recent work on what computers and design there have to offer. But commensurability, yeah, you're absolutely right. And you know, anything that can be segmented in any way can be made into a commensurable, which is where huge amounts of politics happen. And the next project, which I hope someday to get off the ground, is about operationalizing. And I want to understand, I don't, there are histories of quantification, but what doesn't get really studied is how commensurabilities get created around phrases like intelligence is what intelligence measures, which is a classic phrase of operationalizing that mediates between a public that thinks there's some amount of intelligence or creativity in your head and a group of researchers who have formed under a theoretical rubric a set of questions or an instrument, I love that word, to produce something that will go under that rubric. So you're nodding like I've talked too long.
No, I was agreeing.
You were agreeing? That's new. No, I'm sorry. If we don't have fun, why be here? So, you know, I do think about these things, and I mean, I think I've thought a lot about these kinds of images, and I know Ray has hugely thought about tree diagrams and things, but there are some in the more interesting parts of the design literature. There are people who are really, you know, doing a lot of critical work about this, and it's fascinating work. I got here with Paul Byers, who was my advisor. I got introduced to theories of complexity in evolutionary biology, and never have kind of been the same since, for a lot of reasons with him. Anyway, well, he was sort of an old hippie, that's all I'm saying. He was into everything. But but the thing is that actually something that comes along when you put together, say, and people are doing this, I see this happening now in papers that I was happily surprised after having been told I should take Bateson out of my citation list because it showed I was old and out of step, that he has come back, and along with Garfinkel via STEM, and also they get put together with, say, Peirce, Charles Saunders Peirce, and Bateson and Garfinkel, and Ilya Prigogine and some others into a kind of package that actually Paul Byers made for me, Les Peirce, 30 years ago. So I do think that there are good ways, places to go to get your brain challenged to start to think, okay, I have this complexity, how am I going to talk about it?